Hafa to everybody, and thanks for joining us. We're streaming live right now on Facebook, and we're also recording this so that we can put it online via podcast version. My name is Julius Santos. I'm in studio with Tim Rohr. This is GQ, under the podcast GQ. The whole point of the podcast, my platform, is to get people to think. We're not trying to tell you how to think. We're not telling you what to think. We're providing perspectives. We're providing information, and you be the judge. So, Tim, we're going to be talking about the controversy of the church. I listened to you and watched you speak at the Rotary Club. You presented a timeline. You presented facts and documentation within this timeline, and then ultimately you kind of connected the dots, and the scandal here in Guam spans all the way to the Vatican, essentially, and that kind of blew me away. And I really think it's important that we get this information out there, again, so that people can absorb the information and consider it for themselves. And we can also talk about what you just mentioned earlier, the last 5 years, what you've been living through, the fact that you've been fighting this fight and walking through the flames, so to speak, you know what I mean, and having to stay the course in that respect. So let's just get right into it.
Well, thanks, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak about this. I basically sort of retired from action about a year ago after Archbishop Apparon was found guilty by the Vatican on the first go-around. But then a whole new can of worms has opened up, and but unless I'm asked to talk about it, I normally don't talk about it. I do, from time to time, will post on the blog, but not like I used to before, daily or whatever, because pretty much all this is out of my hands now. It's in the hands of the courts and all that kind of thing. So basically I thought, my work is done in a way, so I really haven't been all that active, but it's so a couple of things. You mentioned that I addressed the Rotary Club last week, Rotary Club of Guam, and a couple of things that I spoke there, I'll just repeat here. It just so happened that on the very morning, that very day that I addressed the Rotary Club was the deadline for the bankruptcy cases for the Archdiocese of Ganya. One of the print media ran a story that kind of gave us a good idea of the magnitude of our problem here, and it's something that I've been pointing out for quite a while. Most people have heard or seen the movie Spotlight. I believe it won, the Best Picture or something like that? Okay. And that was about the sex abuse scandal in Boston, which is the most horrific in the whole United States, which is why they made a movie out of it. And it was pretty horrific. But the fact is that it's nothing compared to Guam. The actual numbers are, given the relative populations of Boston and Guam, Boston had a per capita for 100,000, 12 abuse cases per 100,000. Guam has 147, and that's as of last week, and there's been more since then.
That's a huge disparity.
So what's 12 into 147? And if you adjust for the Catholic populations, Guam has a 75% Catholic population. Boston has a 45% population. So that would adjust it up to Boston 16 per 100,000. We're still 9 times, 10 times bigger than Boston, 1,000% larger. How does that happen on a Catholic island, as devout as most people are and as close-knit as families are, or whatever? How does our abuse crisis become 1,000 times bigger than Boston's? It's 1,000% bigger than Boston's. And that's a story that nobody seems to want to tell yet. The AP did a really good expose on a whole thing and drawing out and focusing on the victims and their stories, but what was the culture that engendered 50 years of the most horrific abuse imaginable? What do we need to look at? For years I've been kind of pointing some things out. For instance, Guam has a suicide rate 1.5 times the rest of the nation. For up until we started in 2008, starting advancing pro-life legislation, Guam was the easiest place in the nation to get an abortion. Okay, this was an abortion paradise. Okay. Guam has the highest divorce rate in the whole world, okay, and followed by Russia. Go on, we have the highest teen pregnancy rate. We have the highest out-of-birth wedlock rate. We have a rape rate 3 times the rest of the nation. These aren't, and we're worried about gambling, you know, or the Marines are coming to Guam and they're going to mess up our, you know, this going to become a dangerous place once the Marines get here. The most dangerous place on Guam seems to be right in the family, because I'll tell you, I made mention that one thing that made Guam unique. So that's the bad stuff about Guam. The good stuff about Guam is that we're the only place in the whole world that solved its own problem. In every other place, it's been the press, it's been the attorneys, it's been legislators that went after the church and that kind of thing. Here, it was 70, 80-year-old people that were standing out in front of that cathedral for 54 weeks in a row. Not just standing, but picketing with signs in front of that 9:30 Mass, because that was Apeiron's Mass for many years. Of course, he had already been gone. He fled. That's the really interesting thing there, is that he ran. Okay, at the first act, it was before even Walter Denton came out. It was when Roy Quintanilla, nobody even knew Roy because he hasn't lived here in many years. But as soon as it came out, he ran. Okay, and I've got photos of him actually in Rome meeting with the Pope 2 days after Roy came out with that accusation. So we know where he went. He ran to Papa, you know. So what does that say? Anyway, the fact is that, you know, we're dealing with a really big problem, but the Manamco, the elderly people, were the ones who brought Apeiron down. And they did it by not giving up. They forced the Pope, they rubbed the Pope's nose in it, because every Sunday they were there with their signs. And you saw people you had to respect. You saw people in wheelchairs and walkers and whatever. There wasn't any young people. This wasn't any rabble-rouser. These were people that could probably hardly get out of the house on a Sunday morning, that were walking around in that hot sun with their signs. And basically we brought the walls of Jericho came tumbling down because of that. Sure, I was blogging about it and raising awareness and doing village meetings and stuff like that, but it had all been talk just like everywhere else.
Right.
If it hadn't been for that. And the real energy behind that was a lady named Lou Klitsky. For whatever reason, she decided that she was going to put some people together, and they weren't going to give up. You know, they were going to keep on that. So we solved our problem. Well, we haven't really solved our problem because we haven't addressed the cultural, you know, malaise that's underneath all of this sort of stuff. But kudos to those people for standing up, and they showed the rest of the world how to do it. Because, you know, you read about this all the time. Everybody's complaining about this in their own diocese, and they don't know what to do. And, you know, Guam showed them what to do. You know, somebody has to stand up and not sit down. Right. That's the question. In fact, I was against the public demonstrations at first, and the reason being is that I knew if you couldn't keep it up, then it would work against us, because the Archbishop would be sure to say, look, you know, they were there for 3 weeks and went away. There's nothing to this. Right. So when Lou told me she wanted to start this, I said, great, you can't stop it until the job is done. And I tell you what, she really did the work, you know, to make that happen. You know, stop me if you want to ask a question, but I want to back up to the problems that we've got here. You know, you see it in the news all the time. You know, Guam's horrendous suicide rate. Yeah. And a lot of it is blamed on you know, cultural problems or lost love or whatever.
Relationships and such.
You know, I kind of joked at the Rotary Club. You know, I've lost girlfriends before, but none of them were dying for. You know, so something else is going on. Right. And
that could possibly be the catalyst, but it's something deeper.
Well, I'll tell you, I was just in a conversation with an elderly gentleman a couple days ago. He didn't even know who I was or what I was doing, but it was through my business, and we were talking. And out of nowhere, he asked me, you know, what religion are you? And I said, Catholic. And he said, are you a hardcore Catholic? And I go, yeah, well, pretty much. Well, I have to tell you something. Well, he was molested when he was a child, and he told me the whole story, not just by priests, but by nuns too. You know, and he gave me time, date, location, everything. And then I let him know. I says, well, you know, I'm the guy that helped, you know, expose all this, because he's part of the bankruptcy lawsuit and stuff like that. Okay. But I run across this all the time, you know, and I've run across people who have told me, I mean, he even told me too, said, you know, you tell your father, your grandfather, your mother, whatever, they just slap you down, you know, saying, you know, shut up, don't talk that way about the priest. I even got that, you know, like something bad is gonna happen to me because, you know, I'm talking bad about the bishop, you know, whatever. Right. So there's a cultural fear there, you know, and the priest, especially Apeiron, was really good at inculcating this authoritarian, you know, he always walked around in his papal robes, I called them, right?
Yeah,
You know?
I will say one of the things that he would do regularly really put me off about him, and this is well before any
Yeah.
controversy came out, was he really liked to hold his hand out so he could kiss his ring. And I remember he took a photo once, and in the photo he was kind of had that gesture.
Yeah.
And it just in retrospect, when I think about it,
Yeah.
that always, it was just something off about that. Like,
There was,
he revered
yeah,
himself to
he
too much.
he revered himself. I mean, basically that's what it was. And see, you know, most of the time bishops don't wear all that regalia unless it's for some sort of formal event.
Right.
Usually they're dressed in a regular black, sort of like a priest business suit,
Right.
and they got a chain a chain and a cross that identifies them as a bishop. But when you're just out and about, you're not wearing your full, you know, the phylacteries, right? The Pharisees and they like to wear broad phylacteries, you know. But he was really, you know, was really into himself, and I just kind of blew all that stuff off. But all of it was a way of keeping people quiet and fear. And one of the reasons why the Monamco were the ones that brought him down is because they knew. There wasn't any secrets about Father Tony. All of them knew about Father Tony. And they knew about more than that. And actually, this is going to go back, and this is where I could be very unpopular, and I'm not going to address much of it. But, you know, there's 3 Chamorro bishops that have been accused. Okay? Flores, and then Camacho and Saipan. And all of this happened under Flores. When Aparon was doing all this raping and molesting, it was right under the nose of Archbishop Flores. Okay? And someday that story is going to be, the connection between Aparon and Flores is going to be known.
Right.
So people like to think about Flores as the good old days because people liked him. His demeanor was likable versus Aparon. So people have no problem throwing Aparon under the bus. But you can't touch the sacred cows, you know, when it comes to Flores. And I don't really want to go there. I just will tell you this, that Father Brigard, who was at 170 cases, you know, whatever, all that happened with Archbishop Flores. And Flores the one who scooted him away to Minnesota in 1981. Aparon wouldn't be bishop till 86. So all of that happened under Flores. And nobody really wants to look at that yet, you know, and someday it'll happen, I suppose, but...
You know, when you talk about that and you talk about the culture that inculcated this, the culture that enabled this, and we see it across the board. It's a universal aspect. We see it in families with their individuals with disabilities and how they kind of keep them in the shadows before as we're growing up, and other secrets about families. And one day I just kind of coined it, like it's like the mamala factor, and it's really an insidious kind of cultural, I don't want to say theme, but it's like a cultural element that is insidious because over time it allows for these things. We just don't want to embarrass anybody. We don't want to embarrass the family, so we don't talk about it. Yet, and you mentioned this during the Rotary Club meeting, it's like we don't want to talk about it because we don't want to be embarrassed, yet we're willing to allow these things to happen, these terrible, disgusting things.
Yeah,
You know?
bringing shame on the family is worse than a mortal sin. I mean,
Right.
that's something you just don't do.
Right.
You don't shame the family. So even if your child's being raped and molested by the priest, you shut up about it because we don't want to bring shame and embarrassment on the family.
Right.
Now, Doris Conception, the mother of Sonny Canada, one of the boys who was molested by Aparon but died, admitted this at a public hearing. She described it, and she was so remorseful. You know, she was in tears about, you know, having punished her son for telling on Father Tony and all that kind of, because she was actually cooking for Father Tony.
Right.
You know,
This was the gentleman who would say like his mom would let him go spend the night at his home.
Well, Sonny died in 2005, I think. So, but he did have a brother that testified at the public hearing, and actually probably that's the closest we can get to like I guess a personal witness because. I won't say his name, but anyway, the brother said he and Sonny, the child that died, tried to burn down the rectory where Aparon was staying in Agate. They tried to burn it down, and then Aparon caught him, and then the brother got away, but he hauled Sonny's butt into the house and raped him, according to the brother at the public hearing. Right? You know. Anyway, but backing up to this fact that the name that you use, right? But the bottom line is, you know, we don't bring shame on the family. And I've had victims, you know, who have come public, tell me, you know, quietly, so I won't use any names, but they're adults now with adult children,
Right.
and they've told me that their children have stopped talking to them because they brought shame on the family. You know, they're 70 years old,
Yeah.
and they're coming out with this.
Yeah.
And their adult children, 40 whatever, okay, got mad at them and angry at them. Some even cut them out of their life altogether for doing that. And I'm not going to go too much into my own personal situation, but I could tell that when I was doing this, and as it got dirtier and dirtier, that my own family, which was usually very supportive, like when I was involved with pro-life efforts and stuff like that, my own daughters were out praying the rosary in front of the abortion clinics and very active in the pro-life stuff, so they were on board with that. But when it got to this, I have no idea, but they were not happy with what I was doing. And I didn't even, you know, someday, I don't know if I'll have time today, but I never went after this to begin with. Back in 2013, I saw a priest being treated unjustly, Father Paul Goffigan. It was so unjust that I felt I needed to say something about it. And that's kind of where the Jungle Watch started. And then it exploded and went to all this. But I wasn't even onto this. I had heard of it, but I wasn't onto this at all. It came on its own. You probably have to wait for the book or movie for the whole story. But I do want to bring up what I exposed at the Rotary Club on Thursday for the first time. Nobody knows this. I did it for the first time on Thursday. But the direct tie-in to the Vatican to Guam. So back in 2013, I was just defending Father Paul. And it was just a small-time thing. You know, the traffic was increasing, but I thought, well, it's because a lot of people like Father Paul. And Apron had threatened to fire Paul, or he demanded his resignation, and if he didn't resign, you know, he said to resign or quote unquote face a more painful and arduous closure to your assignment. Okay, now those are the words that got me, and I got a copy of the letter. Father Paul let the letter out, and this is not how a bishop asked a priest to resign. Yeah. So this is mob language, and I knew where it was coming from. You know, the guys that run this place have some Italian last names, and they live in New Jersey. You know, they're former Italian communists. They actually they were running the church on Guam for many years. And I think they still are. I think that they just made their inroads, and I can't say it out loud, but I think they're going to be back very, very quickly. And they just acquired a very large piece of property that will be their base. But we'll go back to what I was talking about. So 2013, I'm defending Father Paul. October 11th, 2013, I get via email a letter with Vatican letterhead, okay, from a cardinal in the Vatican, threatening me to cease and desist picking on Archbishop Apron, or more mob language, to threatening me. But I also could see that it was written by somebody who didn't speak English as a native language. Right. There was too many mistakes. And then the cardinal himself, his name is Cardinal Edwin O'Brien, he put a little sticky note in the left-hand corner saying, asking humbly for your cooperation. So you know how these guys will have somebody write the letter and then they'll just stick a little note on, to that kind of whatever. But it was threatening language to me, cease and desist, and I'm thinking, why is Rome writing me to stop picking on Apron? Well, either Apron or one of Apron's people, and now I know who it is, went to the Vatican to try to shut me down. Wrong thing to do, because then I realized I'm onto something here, and if nothing else, I'm going to fight back. So I wrote that cardinal back twice with 60 pages full of the stuff I already had on Apron, right? And he never replied until 2018. 5 years fast forward.
2013 to 2018.
Okay, fast forward. What he had done, he had threatened to kick me out of an order that I was a member of. It's called the Equestrian Knights of the Holy Sepulchre of Jerusalem. It's like the Knights of Columbus, right. And he was the Grand Master. Okay. And he had threatened to kick me out if I didn't cease and desist. Right? Of course, I didn't cease and desist, and I kept on going. And so 2018, Apron is found guilty by Rome. But if you remember, they were very careful not to say found guilty of what. Right. They said certain of the accusations, which included sex abuse against minors. Right. Apron's local attorney was quick to the microphone saying, we're very relieved that he's been what do you call it, vindicated on most of the charges, and he plans to prove his innocence in the appeal and all this kind of stuff. And the whole thing idea was to try to make it like he was only found guilty on like administrative things, not sex abuse, right? But of course I knew better. But the Vatican was careful not to say that because, and it took them almost 6 months after he was found guilty for them to actually release the statement, okay? So I knew what was going on. You know, the bad guys that run the place, the Italian communists, I'll just refer to them as that, have very high, and I can say this guy's name, Cardinal Fernando Filoni. I can say his name because I have a copy of the letter that he actually wrote to somebody here in the Archdiocese, but basically threatening same kind of thing, like he's in control, you know, that kind of thing. So they got to Filoni. Filoni's known as the Red Pope because he's a cardinal, so he wears red, right. But he actually runs Rome.
Interesting.
He's that powerful. And so Filoni needed to save Aperon, and I kind of knew why by that point. But they did everything they could since they couldn't save him from the verdict because they were going up against Cardinal Burke. Burke is the guy who led the tribunal that prosecuted Aperon and found him guilty. Burke, people don't mess with Burke. Mm-hmm. You know, he's really one tough guy, really knows his stuff. So they knew they couldn't overturn anything, but they could confuse the sentence as much as they could, which is right. What they did. So I write Cardinal O'Brien in March of 2018, and so now that Aperon's been found guilty, you know, can I have you withdraw your threat to kick me out of the order from 2013? And I attached the letter, you know, and he was dumb enough to write back saying, well, he wasn't found guilty of the things you accused him of, because in 2013 I was only accusing him of administrative, you know, neglect, really. So by saying that, he admitted that it wasn't administrative neglect he was found guilty of, it was what's left, sex abuse against minors. Right. So I wrote him back and says, oh, so you're confirming that he was found guilty of sex abuse against minors, okay? He didn't reply.
Right.
5 months later, when was this? Anyway, in August of 2018, I'm actually in the Caribbean at this point, in some family business, and there's a big family event in Ireland, and the Pope is at it, and it was on. I never watch TV because I don't have cable, you know. But just so happens that I was in a hotel and it was on. I was watching EWTN and the Pope. Well, the Pope was on his plane back to Rome, and some reporters came up to talk to him, and they brought up this whole thing of this Archbishop Vigano letter. Okay, Vigano, if you want to look it up. Well, it became extremely famous. In fact, the guy's in hiding now because he wrote an 11-page letter basically linking the Pope and several high-placed cardinals to basically what he characterized as the homosexual cabal, the Lavender Lobby, famously known, operating in the Vatican, that is tied into all these sex abuse cases. Because, see, the dirty little secret is that none of this is about pedophilia. Pedophilia is clinically about adult and inordinate attraction to prepubescent children.
You're talking about the clinical word for that attraction.
Well, that's what pedophilia is.
Yeah, it's very specific to the age range.
It exactly is. But you know, we say everything under 18 is pedophilia. Right. Well, it ain't. Okay,
it's not accurate.
Well, God made you and me adults at about 14 years old. I mean, the fact that society draws a line in the sand at 18 for smoking or drinking or whatever.
It's 21 now. They're shifting it.
Well, that's because we've got some people here that, anyway, whatever.
Yeah, it's federal funding issue, but I understand what you're saying.
Yeah, but it has nothing to do with adulthood.
Right. The puberty stage essentially is where we start to become adults.
That's where you become adults.
Yeah.
In fact, the marriage laws in every state, including Guam until just recently, said that the marrying age for girls is 14. Right. You know why? Because that's when they can conceive. Right. So if you can get married at 14, can't buy cigarettes, but you can get married and have a baby at 14. The reason is that those laws are like so old. It's just based on natural law. Natural law says that at 14, and the guy had to be 16. Right. You know why the Guam changed it to make the girl 16 and the boy 16? After the same-sex union thing got legalized, you can't discriminate, because what if two boys want to marry each other? Right.
Okay? Oh, interesting.
Okay. So could a 16-year-old boy marry a 14-year-old boy? Well, yes, on Guam legally. So they said, "Oh, that's too young. We got to jack it up." So they changed it for that. But anyway,
that's what we want to clarify. Is this is historical language? It's not like we're advocating that sort of union or whatever. It's based historically.
No, it's just these are just facts, you know. But, but I wanted to point that my point of all this is that this is about perverted clergy.
Yeah.
Okay, seeking out adult males.
Yeah.
Okay, that's really what is going on here. But by calling it pedophilia, we're not addressing. So Vigano made the cardinal. This is why I'm talking about this.
Right.
Archbishop Vigano, he was the papal nuncio to the United States, so he knew all these guys, and he wanted to clarify what was really going on. And in Rome, in the Vatican itself, there's these. It's been exposed now. You know, some really wild gay parties. Okay, amongst the clergy. Okay, and that there's it's called the Lavender Lobby. Well, listed in that 11-page letter. Okay.
By Vigano.
By Vigano, the papal nuncio, because he was accusing the Pope of being part of it.
Pope Francis.
Yes. Yeah, because Francis was covering for a guy named Theodore McCarrick. McCarrick was the Archbishop of Washington, D.C., who has finally been kicked out, but he's notorious for his, relations with seminarians and, and if you sleep with me, I'll get you a promotion kind of thing that was going on. It was notorious. And Francis was basically, quote, I won't say it, I shouldn't say it, but anyway, he was together with McCarrick on the same page,
right.
and trying to get McCarrick off. Well, when Vigano came out with that letter, and I'll explain why all this is important, he names the same Cardinal O'Brien in that 11-page letter as part of the Lavender Lobby, the homosexual cabal that was basically behind all of the clergy sex abuse that we're now seeing. That's really what it is. The church and the priesthood and the seminaries for years. I'm from Los Angeles. This started in LA. I mean, it was just common to know that the seminary was known as the Pink Palace. You had to be gay to get in.
Interesting.
Okay? I mean, I saw my own pastor, try to get me. I just knew that I was 17 at the time, and I just said, this doesn't feel right. I'm out of here, kind of thing. Long story. You'll have to wait for the book on that one. But I wasn't new to this when it came up in Guam. I'd been seeing this fester for 40 years, and Vigano just outed the whole thing, that this has been the undercurrent, and now they actually feel they have a pope who's sympathetic to them. So, but Vigano decided, I'm blowing the whistle, on these guys, and he blew the whistle on Cardinal O'Brien, which, looking back at 2013 when he tried to shut me down, O'Brien had to know that the danger of me outing a bishop would lead to a domino effect that would eventually nail him.
Right.
And guess what? 5 years later,
Yeah,
look at the world. Look at the whole world. I just got an email this morning from a friend in Texas where the state of Texas now is doing an investigation of every diocese. Gonna just take it apart and just sue the heck out of them. It's happening in state after state. Because these guys have gotten away with this for so long. So now we know what, this whole thing, this connection to Rome, why they tried to stop. Aperon wasn't just a lone wolf out there. He was part of a much bigger thing that's been going on in the church for a very long time and hurting a lot of people.
Right. And it's not necessarily like a conspiracy in that this group is intentionally going out. They kind of happen to be on the same page, as you put it, and they're all protecting each other in that.
Oh, it's a good old boy network
in
that kind of way, but now it's even more so.
It's systemic, essentially.
It's at the very core. If anybody really, it's not new to the church. There's a great book called the Book of Gomorrah, Sodom and Gomorrah, Book of Gomorrah, actually written in the 11th century by a priest named St. Peter Damian. And back in the 11th century, this problem was really, really deep. And the only thing is that what makes it different now is that we didn't have a sympathetic pope back then to this problem. Right. So it was basically the pope and Peter Damian who cleaned out the church. Took him like 100 years actually to change things around. But see now, that's why Vigano was pointing his finger at the pope. Now,
what happened to Vigano?
So on this August 2018 thing, when the pope is being asked on the airplane back to Rome, one of the reporters brought up about Aperon, because he had just been found guilty. Well, what about Archbishop Aperon in the context of this whole Vigano letter?
Right.
And because Aperon was the only bishop ever tried by a Vatican tribunal. In fact, they didn't even know what to do. They didn't have anything to try a bishop. Yeah, priests, yeah, but bishops, what do you do with them?
Right.
So he was the only bishop ever to be tried by a Vatican tribunal. Of course, he was found guilty. So they said, well, what's going to happen to Apron? Because Apron immediately appealed his sentence as soon as he was, found guilty. And then the Pope said something that really got to me. He said, well, I've taken I've taken the appeal on myself. Now, it's not supposed to, the Pope isn't supposed to take on the appeal himself. The appeal is supposed to go back through the tribunal and through what's called the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, where you've got 12 other people there that basically can rule on this, right? So the Pope was bypassing all that and said he's going to take care of it himself. I immediately thought, Filoni, and then the people that he's connected to, okay, they have to save Apron. This is their last gasp. And I think the Pope would have granted the appeal based on nothing,
Right.
because he's the Pope.
Right.
He's the lawmaker. He can just do it. But because the McCarrick thing was so hot right then, it was blowing up all over him. I think the Pope said, "No, I'm not going to risk myself from some guy I don't even know where he's from." That kind of a thing. And so he denied the appeal famously. It took until just a couple months ago. He denied the appeal. Yeah. And so there's that connection. But I mentioned also at the Rotary Club that this isn't over. People have been focusing on this whole bankruptcy case with the Archdiocese and so on, but it's only really a small piece of it. There's a couple other bigger pieces, which I'll come to, but one of the pieces is Apron's own civil trial, because he's been accused by Walter Denton and others, and they're suing him personally.
Right.
And Apron's not a poor man, okay? He's suing him personally. And Apron's defense is going to be that he's the victim of a conspiracy led by real estate mediators, me. Okay, now that's been in the news several times. I've got press releases from the Archdiocese of Gannett going back to 2016 accusing me of doing what I was doing because I had a financial interest in selling the Jonia property, the former seminary. Okay,
right.
And so when Apron was found guilty in 2018, that's the first thing that he said, and I have it in writing, that he's going to prove his innocence by showing that he's a victim of a conspiracy, led basically by real estate mediators, right? Okay, well, guess who, So, now, I'm going to just touch on something shortly, but it occurred to me when I walked into the studio that I need to say this. In March of, Apron was found guilty March 16th, 2018. March 24th, 2018, I got a phone call from a friend, okay? Word, quote unquote, word is amongst the clergy that, and I won't say who, somebody is going to go to the media about you. They did, and they went to KUAM, and they went to Crystal Paco. May 9th, KUAM, Crystal Paco, I get a WhatsApp message. And if she's listening, Crystal, I've saved it all, okay? WhatsApp message, and she texts me a picture of some complaints against me by my own children. One of these days I'm going to be able to prove all of these false, and I'm going to be able to prove the money trail that's behind it all. But KUAM ran 2 hit pieces on me, smear pieces on me, destroying me as a wife beater and a sexual molester of my own children, okay, for 2 nights in a row. Then the Guam Daily Post and PNC ran another 2. So for a whole week, the guy who stood up alone for 4 years, right? Believe me, I'm not here to exonerate myself, but if I had any skeletons like that in my closet, you think I'd be standing alone against the most powerful man in Guam for 4 years? But when it happened, I knew exactly what it was. Because see, that message, that phone call, word is amongst the clergy. Okay, why is word is amongst the clergy that so-and-so is going to the media about me? Apron and his people, they knew. And I found out which clergy it was. Because I came across that email just recently, started doing some research, and I know exactly where it came from, who it came from, and the whole thing is about discrediting, because in order for Apron to save himself, he has to discredit me to begin with, right? And I won't say why, I don't want to bring my family into this any more than I have to, but I'll tell you what, I didn't run. I'm still here. I'm sitting here talking to you.
Right.
Okay? Look at everybody else who ran. Luis Camacho, the guy found in the car, helping himself to a 17-year-old girl down in Agate, priest, right? John Wadeson, as soon as I outed him, I don't know if you remember the name, but I outed him back in 2014 it was, and he ran away. Aperon, one accusation, he ran away, nobody can find him. And, they did find him. You remember where they found him?
What state was that?
They found him hiding in a house in San Francisco,
right,
owned by the vice president of the Bank of Guam, where Aperon gave all his business. Every school, church, everything had to have their money and accounts in Bank of Guam. So where's Aperon hiding? San Francisco, Bank of Guam. Okay. David Luan hired, it was on the front page of the Post, if you remember. He had grown a beard, tried to cover himself up, all that kind of stuff.
I remember that photo.
This is worse than, I don't think Dan Brown could write a novel about this. No, I mean, this is really, really, really terrible stuff. It's terrible stuff.
It's shocking to hear. That's, to put it lightly.
Well, we're not even getting close, to some of it. There's a couple other cases. There's another really big case, and it's against the Capuchins. Have to remember, Capuchins are really at the bottom of all this. Who ran Guam for almost 100 years? Capuchins. Right. This place didn't become a diocese until, 60s or something like that. And even the first bishop was a Capuchin, Baumgartner. Right. Okay. Flores, of course, was the first local bishop, but this was all Capuchins.
If you could explain that for most people who don't understand the difference between the Capuchins running the church in Guam versus it being a diocese.
Yeah, first of all, the Capuchin Franciscans are a religious order versus what they call a secular or diocesan priests. So a religious order, it would be like monks or nuns,
right,
okay? And diocesan priests are basically kind of like the businessmen. They're called secular priests. They're allowed to, they don't have to take a vow of poverty. They can have their own assets and just run like a regular life, really, just chastity and obedience, but not poverty. So because Guam was kind of like a mission for so long, and it was mission, we had the Augustinian friars, and then but anyway, the Capuchins established here. Well, what was Aperon when he was molesting all these kids? Capuchin. Okay? All of them were Capuchins. They were at the bottom of all of this, right? And there's like 3 or 4. There's another guy named Andy Mineta. There was the one that Mr. Leo Tudela, I forget the name. Anyway, it goes on. But most of this was overseen by, the Capuchins. Well, so if you look in any of the lawsuits that have already been filed, it names, amongst the Boy Scouts if it had to do with what's his name, but it also names the Capuchins, because Aperon was a Capuchin. He still is a Capuchin, right? Okay, so he's still a member. Now he's released from his vows to the Capuchin, but he was a Capuchin priest at the time that he was doing all of this stuff. And at the time, most of these things happened. So there's a big lawsuit against the Capuchins, and I don't know what's going to happen. I bring that up because, not to badmouth, we got to be honest about things. There's people that have like certain affections towards their parish or their church, right, not my church, not my priest, right, not my...
I was just thinking that.
Yeah. And the Capuchins are always seen as, kind of the favorite, the brown robes, right, all that kinds of stuff. And I've had people say, hey, we have Capuchins in our parish and we want to keep it that way and all that kind of stuff. Well, what do you think Aperon was? Mount Carmel was a Capuchin parish for many years, going back to before Aperon. That was my parish. When I moved to Agate, I always heard about the Agate boys, but in 1994 when I moved to Agate, I began really hearing about it. And lo and behold, someday I would meet the Agate boy himself, Walter Denton, which led to everything, else. And so that's a lawsuit that's going on. There's also lawsuits against the Sisters of Mercy, and
that was an interesting one when that came up.
Yeah, and there's a lot of small stuff. People sometimes say like, well, how did we know we're telling the truth? I did talk to one of the victims, and he was grilled mercilessly by Guam archdiocesan lawyers, okay, to the point where they had him breaking down, crying, and everything. But he wouldn't move from his story. Right. Yeah. Now I know that the archdiocese, because of bankruptcy, is not grilling people anymore about it, because basically they throw it in the towel. It's not even in their hands anymore.
Yeah, I wanted to address that. When you're talking about people who may be watching, may be listening, who will get upset. It's like you're talking about my priest, you're talking about my church, and when after your talk at the Rotary Club of Guam, you know, you mentioned it because I talked about what about those who may be losing their faith now, finding all of this out, and you talked about the emphasis on, you know, the faith is in Jesus, it's in God, it's not in your priest. You know, your priest is kind of like the conduit who helps you get there, and I think that was very important because in that message, you know, you were saying we need to be diligent, we need to be vigilant in ensuring that the church is not going to cleanse itself. It's a community thing. We need to be the watchdogs of it. Same way when we keep government in check. You know, by electing leaders we believe will serve us and represent us appropriately and properly. And it's the same thing with the priests. And you know, I talk to a lot of people who say, well, I don't know how to defend, because I'm a Catholic as well. And they're like, I don't know how to defend myself when people start, you know, criticizing the church. And it's, well, you have to have that faith, and your faith is not in that individual. It needs to be in Jesus. It needs to be in God, and that's where you have that strength. And that's where you should want to purge the church of all of this evil that's going on.
Yeah. Well, as you know, I had a couple of quips on that. And, you know, one of the things I always point out is, like, bad priests started with Judas.
Right.
And Jesus picked him.
Yeah.
Like, so, you know, are you going to leave Jesus because of Judas?
Yeah, I love how you put it. It's very succinct.
Essentially, that's what it is. I mean, the bad guys are everywhere. And Jesus actually picked the first the first 12 apostles were the first bishops. Yeah. So bad bishops started with Judas, and Jesus himself picked him, you know. But most people use this whole thing going over the church as an excuse you know, to cover for themselves. You know, they stop practicing the faith long ago, or they're involved in some sort of sexually promiscuous relationship anyway, or there's living some kind of an immoral life, and they don't like the church's teachings on sex or this and that. And so we'll just say, well, look at the priests and the bishops. You know, why should we do them?
And it's a way to kind of discredit it, to water it down. I think there's
Make
a lot
yourself
of people
feel better is what they're doing.
There's a lot of people, I believe, who are resentful of the church, and you know, because in my 20s I veered. I stopped going to church on Sundays, and I just kind of started doing whatever I wanted to do, so to speak. And then when I found the church again, and I started to kind of walk the path and try to be closer to Jesus, closer to God, I told a friend of mine, really close friend of mine, and she was like, oh no, now God's going to tell you what to do. And that's where I started to see that resentment. It's like, well, why do I have to do this? Why does God want me? It's like, God gave you free will. You don't have to. God wants you to submit yourself to him. He wants you to choose if you want to be close to him. Otherwise, go and do whatever the hell you want to do. But you see the consequences of it, which is what draws you back. If you have any sense left in you, you know, if you're not too lost. And so there's that really deep-seated resentment.
Yeah, well, and that's going to be understandable, especially since we're now into the second generation of this false teaching of mercy in the church, that God loves you no matter what.
Yeah, no, that's not true.
I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Read the Gospels.
Yeah.
Jesus warns about the sheep and the goats. Yeah. I will come and separate the sheep from the goats, the weeds and the wheat. Okay, and if anybody really wants to get into it, I have books easy to find. I think it's even on Amazon. It's called Why I'm Catholic, with my last name. I think you can get downloaded for $2 or something like that. But essentially, I make out the point that, look, man, I don't care what you believe or don't believe. Right. You're going to die.
Yeah.
And there's either something after this or there isn't. So 50-50 chance that there is, right?
Right.
Okay. And if there is, then what is after this? Okay. So this 50-50, that's pretty bad odds. Man.
Yeah.
I mean, you know.
Yeah.
And if there is something after this, what we do know is that there's eternal damnation. I mean, you can believe in nirvana or go, you know, through the whole reincarnation thing or whatever. But really, there's only two religions that teach that there's an eternity. Okay, and that's the Christianity and Islam.
Right.
Islam, of course, is basically a Christian heresy.
Right. It's based on the Bible, right?
Muhammad. Yeah. Muhammad was actually learned from a heretic named Nestorius. Nestorianism was a heresy, and Nestorius was the equivalent of the Pope of Constantinople. That's how high this was. And he was teaching a heresy, basically, that Jesus really isn't both God and man and whatever, and that's why Islam doesn't. Islam respects Jesus as a prophet, but not as God, right? And anyway, go on and on. But both Islam and Christianity believe that there's the eternal damnation or there's eternal happiness. Right. Okay, now they have different definitions of what that is. But eternal damnation is something that not you know, when you get to 50-50, that's not something you want to mess around with.
Right.
You know.
Right.
And so, you know, long story short, I kind of make that point. Says, well, you know, you better figure it out because you're going to die.
Yeah.
You know, you're going to die, and you're going to have to face, well, 50-50 chance you're going to have to face something.
Right.
is from a, if you're a betting man, then I think, you better place your odds. It's called Pascal's wager. As a scientist or whatever,
That's
it was
interesting,
Blaise
Pascal's
Pascal, he was
Yeah,
a
yeah.
philosopher. And that's how he basically presented it, as a wager.
Yeah.
Hey, 50-50.
Well,
I'm going to try to hedge my bets here.
That really puts things into perspective too, because then
Yeah.
people can argue and say, well, you only live once, and so I want to maximize the amount of fun.
No,
the
you
amount
live
of
you
adventure.
live twice.
Right.
The
So
second time's forever.
With that perspective, it's like, well, okay, and
Yeah.
and if you can give in to your a good friend of mine says giving in and being a slave to your primal what did he call it? But essentially, like, I want to do this, so I will do it. And religious perspective, then I look at it from
Yeah.
a psychological perspective and a
Yeah.
philosophical perspective. The more you give in to your base desires, that's where you say you're a slave to your base desires,
Yeah.
and there is no practice of delayed gratification. And in the teachings of Catholicism, there's a lot of delayed gratification. It's a lot of sacrifice in that sense, right? Pick up your cross, carry it,
Yeah.
which is really do what you need to do before you do what you want to do, because you'll find more happiness in that. You'll find more gratification. You'll find more peace
Yeah.
and content.
Well, there's Bishop Sheen, famous bishop on TV a lot back in the 50s, 60s, says something that I've always remembered, and that is, God will forgive. Okay, so you're sorry, but God will forgive. And man can forgive.
Yeah.
I can choose to forgive. He said, but nature never forgives.
Mm.
So people create their own hell.
Right.
You can say, well, I'm just going to drink, eat, and be merry.
Yeah.
Okay, but look at the number. There's a doctor's clinic right underneath my real estate office, and he takes Medicaid, so you kind of see like all the people that really can't afford any kind of medical care, and they're standing outside smoking and coughing up their lungs, and I don't want to point it out because of the look, but anyway, we already know that. You want to smoke? Okay. You want to drink yourself to death? Okay, you will. You don't have to wait for God to pronounce judgment on you.
Right.
You create your own living hell.
Yeah.
Your body starts to give out, 50, 60 years old, you've been mistreated. I'm 63, Thank God I kind of took care of myself, because there's a lot of guys my age that ain't doing so well,
Right.
mostly because of their lifestyle, right? So the idea of overcoming nature, that's precisely what we were baptized into.
Yeah.
We were given supernatural powers
Yeah.
and grace through the sacraments, through the church, to overcome nature.
Yeah.
Because nature says, look, this is good, don't worry, go ahead, take a bite, you
Yeah.
can be like God.
The fruit
I
of
mean,
the
that's
tree,
the first
yeah.
one, like, give in to your pleasure, give in to
Yeah.
your desire, and nothing's changed,
Right.
right? But we already know, like, if you're an athlete or whatever, you're constantly denying yourself. You're
Yeah.
constantly disciplined. You want to succeed in anything.
Right.
You want to become a doctor. You want to become a great, radio guy like Jason over here or whatever. I mean, there's a discipline.
Yeah,
You're
absolutely.
overcoming. You get up in the morning, you don't feel like getting out of bed, but you do it because you overcome. There's nothing new about this. So for people to say, when it comes to religion, they can't tell me what to do, whatever. Well, they ain't telling you what to do.
Yeah.
God doesn't send anybody to hell.
No.
He just lets you take yourself there by yourself.
And that's the epiphany that I had over again when I found my way back to the church was the 10 Commandments, the story of Moses, and they were in the desert and they were worshiping the cow, and everybody was having sex with everybody, and things were just crazy, and he goes up in the mountain and God speaks to him and he gives him these 10 Commandments, and it's the language of the times, right? So when I talk to people today, my contemporaries, I tell them, consider them challenges. And God says, if you want to be closer to me, if you want to find happiness, and when I say happiness, it's fleeting. Otherwise, it doesn't mean anything. If you're always happy, then what does that mean? So to be content with yourself, to accept the bad that's in your life, but to be grateful for what is good, right? And that's where you find that real, that's where I found my contentment. That's where God really spoke to me and said, look at what you're doing here. You're chasing happiness. These instantaneous moments of joy that you feel that you're artificially creating.
Yeah.
What's the value of that versus the value of delayed gratification?
Yeah.
Restricting yourself more from these pleasures so that when you do imbibe in them, they're that much more meaningful. Like,
Since you're talking about Moses, I mean, they get out there on the way to the promised land, and
Yeah.
what did the Israelites want to do? Hey, take us back to the flesh pots of Egypt.
Yeah,
We
yeah.
don't mind being slaves.
Yeah,
At
they
least
didn't-
we had food.
Yeah,
that kind of
exactly.
thing, right?
Yeah.
And that's
First they wanted to be
yeah.
free, then they're free in the desert, and they're like,
Yeah.
we'd rather go back to being slaves. Yeah,
Yeah.
it was very interesting.
how we doing
story.
on time?
We're still pretty good.
Well, just
yeah.
one more thing about
We're
the Moses
really-
thing.
we got
I just
another half
happened
hour
to
if
be
you want.
listening to a radio station. It wasn't the Catholic radio station, but there's some pretty good non-Catholic radio stations that got some pretty good preachers on. And this morning, this guy was talking about, hey, when God told Moses, "Let my people go," where did he say to let them go to? Right. The promised land wasn't even in the picture at that point. Right. Let my people go. You know the answer to that? Just a little catechism quick. To go into the wilderness and worship. That's what they were to do when they left Egypt. There wasn't anything about going. They didn't know if they were going for a day, 2 days, 40 years. He wanted the Israelites to go into the wilderness and worship. The wilderness was the desert. Yeah. You know, and so God sometimes, God not just sometimes, all the time. He's going to take you to the desert. Yeah. Okay, before he leads you to the land flowing with milk and honey. Mm-hmm. And people get to the desert and they say, "No, man, I want to go back to the flesh pots of Egypt." Right. So he promises the cross. He promises the desert. But the second thing there, he wanted to teach them how to worship him. And if you ask anybody today, do you worship Jesus? Well, a lot of people say, well, how do you do that? Well, I just praise the Lord, whatever. And some people say, well, I can worship, I can pray at the beach or the golf course or whatever it happens to be. And I said, well, that's not worship, right. And so what are you talking about? He says, well, how did Jesus say he wanted to be worshipped, right? Well, there's only one way. There's only one time. He gives a specific command on the night before he died. He broke the bread, wine. Do this in commemoration. The word is commemoration, acknowledgement of me. This is how I want to be worshipped. Right. God's number one desire of all of us is to be worshipped, right? And there's a right way to worship. There's right worship. And I believe that a lot of our problems stem from clergy and so on when we decided that we can decide, how to make it more fun, And for 40 years we've been chasing the Protestants down the street to get, better guitars and bands and whatever else to make it more entertaining liturgy. No, there's a right way to worship. And I believe that all of our problems stem from not worshiping correctly. We worship ourselves. We turn the priests around and get the people. Who are facing? Each other. Before, you're not old enough, but before, everybody was facing God together.
I've seen some photos and some footage.
That's worship.
Where even the priest was facing the cross as well.
Well, it still does in the old traditional mass, but you don't see that. But as soon as they turn the priest around, okay, now the problem here is that now the priest matters. Oh, I like Father so-and-so, I don't like Father so-and-so, whatever. But when the priest, he didn't have his back to the people. They were all facing God together.
Yeah. Okay. It's very interesting that you mentioned that because I used to say that when I was spending a lot of my time surfing before I had a job that actually required 8 hours. It's one of those, lifeguard and whatever. So I would say this is where I do my worshiping. I'm worshiping, God here in the church. And you're so right. We can't choose to do that. And people say, well, why does it have to be there? Just asking the question is selfish in itself. And so that's like, okay. Again, it's all about delayed gratification. It's all about sacrifice. Can you go there? Can you sit down and shut up for 1 hour and go through this ritual that I find now that I'm older, more mature, is very meditative, standing up, sitting down, kneeling. It's like if you can't even do that, especially as an adult, how can you expect to put the rest of your life in order if you can't sacrifice 1 hour to come in, sit down, listen to the story, find the universal relevance that's happening in your life, within the gospel.
Well, if I can, this is good, and I'd like for people to do that. But even if you can't find anything, because a lot of times people say, you gotta put something in to get something out. At the bare minimum, you are showing up on Sunday for an hour because Jesus said, do this. Yeah. No other reason. Right. This is how, and here's what happens if you don't do this. Matthew 10:32. He who acknowledges me, I will acknowledge to my Father. In other words, you ain't going to heaven unless you acknowledge me. Right. He who does not, I will not acknowledge to my Father. You're going to hell, right? And how does he want to be acknowledged? Right. Okay? He said, do this in memory of me and to commemorate me. This is how I want to be acknowledged, right? And, it's one of my favorite subjects. I could really go on there because I struggled with that for a long time. Like, what is wrong? Because I never miss Mass, but most of the time I'm struggling. There's something wrong here because it doesn't seem to be about God at all. It seems to be about the next song. I used to be a choir director, and I was like really into everybody clapping for me at the end. I was like really good on the guitar and this and that. And I did it for years. I got paid to do it, But after a while, I felt this is something wrong with this, so I stopped doing it altogether, And it's very difficult even now. I'm not putting down anybody who does music or whatever. It's fine. But the more I've learned, the more I realize that, there's very little of Jesus in the Mass, almost any Mass that you go to. And whenever I can, I try to go to the Mass where it's ad orientem, which is where they're all facing the same way, because at least that takes the distraction out. Anyway, we're kind of off topic, but
I think it's good that, because we're talking about all of these really negative, ugly, disgusting, vile elements that have infiltrated the church for a long time now.
Horrible perversions.
I think it's also it's good that we balance it with what good that comes out of it. You talk about the choir, and when I joined the 1130 choir at Cathedral, as much as I love the music, I found it very difficult to get back into that meditative state where God is actually talking to me, where my relationship with God it's very interesting. He's kind of like this really tough father to me. I'll ask him questions, and then I'll kind of, the answer will be there in my head, and he'll just kind of look at me like, really, that's the answer. You want forgiveness from this person, but you're not willing to forgive them for that. You can't hold anything over anybody's head and then ask them for their forgiveness.
Well, let me ask you this. I mean, why haven't you lost your faith over this clergy sex abuse scandal?
Because I understand that these individuals are violating the purest, most innocent trust of the congregation. They are putting, I wouldn't say wrongfully, but mistakenly putting their faith in him to lead them when their faith should be in Jesus and in God. And for them to take advantage of that and to use
anyway, you recognize them as evil and not the
I don't
church,
see
right?
I don't
these
see
are the
institution
Judases.
itself.
These are the what do you call it? The satanic infiltrators.
Correct. They're trying to take it down. I mean, you look at the public school system. How many here in Guam? How many teachers have we had? How many school aides have we had? Violate that. So any institution is at risk for infiltration, for people to get into a position of authority so that they can have their way with it. And so again, to have blind faith in the institution to correct itself is a mistake. We have to remain diligent.
I would just kind of like, I know we're getting close to the end here, so I just kind of like would say that.
We have another 20 minutes.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Well, we can talk about it a little bit more then, because to be honest with you, I'm a little bit pessimistic going forward.
You did say that. You said you believe it's going to get worse, a lot worse.
Well, not just on what Apron plans to do and all this kinds of thing. I kind of see people thinking, we got our parish back. Might as well go ahead and mention this, but the whole thing has been, they just wanted to get the neos out, right? And if they get the neos out, then everything's going to be okay.
Right.
Well, the neocats, there's pros and cons or whatever, and I've always make a point that it's never about the actual people.
Right.
I can go into why that all happened in the first place. But the guys that run the neocats are very aggressive people, and I believe they even teach heresy, but I can go into that another time. But they were very aggressive, very powerful. Of course, they were favored by Aperon, so they got into positions of power.
Right.
And that upset, it's like people say, well, that was always my pew. What are you doing sitting at? That kind of attitude, or they, Father always trusted me with the money, and now these neocats are running things. So there was this position of power. There was even a fight amongst the choirs. Like there was the neocats versus whatever. Anyway, I sort of see people that all they wanted to do is just get the neocats out and get back to their, planning the next fiesta. That's kind of what it was. And there's no attempt to actually address everything that was bad that gave, like we talked about from the beginning. That there was no attempt to address, how was it that, we're the worst in the world, and yet we celebrate ourselves as a wonderful family-friendly culture and this and that, and all these bad things happen everywhere else too. But in Guam, of course, it's magnified, because it was closed like it was for so long. And of course, it's small, so we see it more. But it's really hard to argue with those numbers. 147 per 100,000 versus Boston, which is number 2 at 12. Yeah. And so there's something that's really wrong here. I kind of know what it is, if we really want to get down to it. Part of that is the whole thing about the shame in the family.
What I coined is the mamala factor. You don't want to talk about it.
Yeah, and so long as people don't want to go there, we're not going to solve anything. Yeah. Because most of the abuse isn't happening by the priests. Where's most of the abuse happening?
Yeah, it's in the home.
It's in the family. It's in the home. By people known to the victim.
Right. It's terrible.
Well, on that, Guam has twice the child neglect, it's called child maltreatment rate, in the rest of the nation, okay? So just in child abuse alone, we are twice as worse as the rest of the nation.
Yeah. And you know, if there are people out there who are getting upset, like, oh, why are you talking bad about
Yeah,
Guam?
and-
It's like,
and-
we're not talking bad about Guam. We are talking about families that are neglecting their kids and the high rate that it happens here on Guam.
Yeah.
And, you know, I've seen the connection between the blind faith and the leadership of the church, and also in government. The government should fix our problems. The government should end crime and this. It's like all of that stems from the family values, the core values, and really there's a loss of emphasis there. And with those values and with that good family setting, there's going to be sacrifice and restrictions and delayed gratification. And you know, there's this real ever since like the PC era. There's maybe even before that. There's just been this directional change in culture and values. It's like just go and be happy, and you know, it's like, okay, well, what is that? What are you bypassing and all of that? And look at the negative consequences that stem from that. You know, people don't want to be strict or mean with their kids, but
well,
I don't know. I'm
we're
kind
not
of going
we're-
off on a tangent.
No,
here.
but I mean, and that's we're trying to get to the bottom of it. And I have a really easy formula for all of it, and it's this: as the church goes, so goes the world. The church tries to blame the world. They try to say, oh, we got more distractions nowadays, and we got the sex culture now. No, as the church goes, so goes the world. Because before Woodstock, there was Vatican II. Vatican II undermined the basic underpinnings of things that people took for granted, part of the church. It created questions that kind of led to the sexual revolution. They want to blame it the other way. But as church goes, so goes the world. Now, here's why I use that, and it's not my saying. It comes from Jesus himself saying, you are the light of the world.
Yeah.
Okay. Jesus Christ gave himself body, blood, soul, and divinity for his church.
Right.
We have everything we need to be supernatural, to be perfect. Be ye perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect. He's given us everything we need, and Catholics alone can do this because, sorry Protestants, but we're the only church, okay, who has those sacraments. The body, blood, soul, and divinity. We got the actual body and blood of Jesus Christ. We have the sacraments. We have all of that. So if something's wrong with the world, it's because something's wrong with the church. And people try to make it out, oh, I'm trying to destroy the church, back the Catholic Church. I'm talking bad about the Catholic Church. Yeah, I am. You know, I don't have anything to talk about it. I just have to point to the stats. 147 per 100,000, 10 times worse than Boston. I mean, that's where it really is. So the church itself, now how do you fix that? Well, you have to, you have to live holy lives, starting with you. You have to stop sinning.
Yeah.
And most people are not going to give up their contraceptive pills or whatever else they're using.
And it's all of that kind of
That's
stuff at the
that's
same
the dirty
time.
little secret.
When you talk about Woodstock, you talk about the birth control pills.
It's all about sex without consequences at the bottom line when it comes. That's what abortion
and
is.
it really,
you know?
when I look at it today, and especially with social media, Instagram, and Snapchat, and all these things, and I see women devaluing. They're probably going to be very upset at me for saying this, but
welcome to the club.
I see them devaluing themselves online, and it's like, okay, well, you want to look sexy.
Yeah.
Who are you doing it for? Why are you doing it?
Yeah,
and
that's.
I was speaking with a female friend of mine, and she was kind of entertaining me. I was being a little bit cynical, but jokingly about it. And I said, "Look at these pictures." I said, "Would you want to show this picture to your father?" And she's like, "No." So why are you putting it on the internet for the world to see it? And then you turn around and question why people are judging you a certain way. It's like, because you're putting yourself out there. You want to call it fearless? It's like, no, you're being dumb.
Yeah.
But hey, that's, people are going to do what they want to do, and if they're not willing to take on, and I think there's, again, it's that resentment to
When's
responsibility.
the last time you went to church and heard a sermon about modesty?
That's a good point.
Okay.
That's a very
So
good
why
point.
should we wonder, like, why are people being immodest, which is what they're doing? Does the church still value modesty?
Right.
Look at the people that go to church. Look at how people are dressed. I had a priest say, well, it doesn't really matter as long as they come. Wait a minute. If you were going to a party, you would dress nicer than that.
Yeah.
But
or I mean, because sometimes I see individuals going to church dressed like they're going to the club, and sometimes I give them the benefit of the doubt and say, well, maybe they just don't understand what is appropriate dress for church, right? You want to look your best.
Well, these things used to be taught.
Yeah. Well, sure enough, when I was growing up, had to have the hair combed and the pants and everything.
Because you're going to see the king.
Yeah.
It's about worship.
Right.
But when we made it about each other, well then, but I bring that back because what you were saying about before has to do with basically an immodest culture, an exhibitionist culture.
Yeah.
Well, that has to be taught. Okay, that's a value that has to be taught.
Well, that's
Where
what-
would you hear it from?
That's what we
Yeah.
evolved from.
Yeah.
That's what made us higher beings. Is we used to, again, be slaves to our base desires. I need to eat. I need to breed. I can be violent because I need to control my territory. But the church helped us evolve past that. And you highlighted that perfectly in the beginning, where you said, "Here's the fruit. You can give into your base desire and eat it, and find your pleasure in its sweetness,
Yeah.
or you can listen to." You can take on God's challenge and not eat that fruit, and have everything else that you need to do. But again, Adam, Eve did it, and then Adam bit it, and God came down and said, "What happened?" He goes, "It's her fault." So that's when the sin just started. I had the fruit, and now I'm lying.
Yeah,
Yeah.
a culture of blaming.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
anyway.
Yeah, we're reaching that time now, man. It's been a
Okay.
really great discussion.
Yeah, well,
I hate to end it now. I'd love to have you back on. Maybe we can do this at least once or twice a month.
Whenever there's going to be a lot of fireworks happening here pretty
Yeah.
soon, and
Go
I'm
ahead.
planning on going after the people who came after me. Like I told you before, I've had death threats,
Yeah.
threats of violence, threats against my family, lawsuits. The archdiocese threatened to sue me publicly several times. I'm not done with them. I have a lawsuit waiting to happen. My own lawsuit with them. I've just been waiting for the right time to do all this, and the time is coming.
Well, I want to thank you for coming here. I know early in the conversation you mentioned that a former colleague that was working here ran hit pieces on you, was on our station. But the fact that you're here and we can discuss this, I really appreciate that.
She now has a very high-paying job.
Yeah, I know. I wouldn't want that job, though. I'll tell you that much right now.
Yeah, well.
But again, thank you for coming on. We
Yep.
look forward to having you again. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for watching, for listening. I'm Julius Santos. This is Tim Rohr. Thank you.